It was 1932, and Clara was still stitching. The world outside had crumbled, but she could only focus on the needle, pulling it through fabric, stitching together what others called waste. In a time when pride and practicality had little room to coexist, this was the only way she could hold on to something, her family's dignity. Before we dive into Clara's journey, let us know where you're watching from. If stories of survival and ingenuity in the Dust Bowl era resonate with you, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's story might just outlast this one. Clara's fingers were stiff with cold. The wind howled outside the small, weather-beaten cabin, cutting through the cracks in the walls, yet she hardly noticed. She had become accustomed to the chill that settled in her bones by now. It had been a year since the crops failed, since the bank had foreclosed, and since they had lost the farm that had been in her husband's family for generations. She sat at the makeshift table, by the dim window, the lamp's weak light flickering, casting shadows on the worn fabric around her. A few feet away, her 3 children huddled together near the stove, wrapped in layers of old blankets. The girls' faces were pale, their hair unkempt, but their eyes, those bright, wide eyes, held a quiet strength. They watched her, as they always did, their faces silent but full of hope. Clara had never thought she would be one of those women, the ones who turned feed sacks into dresses, but when she realized just how scarce clothing had become in the small town of Red Rock, the idea began to seem more like a necessity than a choice. No one said it outright, but Clara could feel the judgments. Her neighbors' eyes narrowed whenever they saw her sewing. They whispered behind their hands, shaking their heads. They called it a foolish idea, a waste of time when food was scarce and survival was everything. But Clara knew better. She had seen how the weather had turned the world upside down. The fields had been barren for years, and the drought that was choking the land was only getting worse. And so, she sewed. Each stitch was a quiet rebellion against the harsh realities they were living, in a refusal to let the world take everything from them, including their pride. The feed sacks were a dull beige, decorated with faded blue and red letters, the remnants of something that once held grain or flour. Clara smiled to herself as she cut the fabric, still remembering the first time she'd seen the sacks stacked in the corner of the barn. It had seemed like a joke at first, a simple thing she had no use for. But now, those sacks had become a lifeline, stitched together to make dresses and shirts for her children. She would turn these scraps into something that would keep them warm, something that would remind them, as the wind howled outside, that they were still alive and they were still family. It was the 3rd week of December when the first real snowstorm hit. The wind had been relentless all day, but by nightfall it began to snow in thick, heavy sheets, sweeping over the barren fields like a white blanket that covered up the ruins of what had once been their life. The cabin creaked in the wind, but inside, Clara's needle never slowed. Her sewing machine hummed steadily, the rhythmic sound almost soothing amidst the chaos of winter outside. The girls had learned to keep themselves busy while Clara worked. Lily, the oldest at 9, sat near the fire, trying to keep the younger 2 occupied with the few toys they had left. Her hands, too, were stained with flour from the few loaves of bread they managed to bake earlier that week, and her face, bright with a childlike eagerness, held a solemn maturity that Clara couldn't ignore. It was the same maturity she had seen in her own mother when she was a girl, that same look that said, "We endure, no matter what." The stitching was slow at first, but Clara was a woman who knew how to focus. The feed sacks weren't the finest fabric. They weren't even meant to be fabric at all. They were stiff and rough, the threadbare prints fading from years of use. Yet, with each stroke of the needle, Clara found something in them that transcended their origins. They weren't just sacks anymore. They were something greater than they ever had been. The clothes that she crafted from those sacks were never perfect. There were crooked seams, uneven hems, and the occasional patch where the fabric had torn. But to Clara, each imperfection was a testament to her resolve. She remembered the first time she had worn one of the dresses she had made from those sacks. It had been rough on her skin, stiff and unyielding, but she had walked out into the yard with a sense of pride. Her children had watched her from the porch, and when she smiled, they smiled too. It wasn't just about the clothes, it was about survival. It was about doing what needed to be done, even when the past world seemed to offer no hope. Clara's heart swelled with a quiet pride, knowing that in the midst of the Dust Bowl's cruelty, she had found a way to preserve something essential to keeping the family together. The storm raged outside, but inside Clara's cabin there was warmth in the air, in the room, in her hands. And as she sewed, she whispered to herself, "We'll make it through." The storm lasted through the night, the wind's howl turning to a steady, eerie whisper by morning. The snow was deep outside, piled against the cabin's door and windows. It was a winter that felt endless, like the horizon itself had disappeared beneath a blanket of white. Clara couldn't remember the last time the sun had shown its face. Days bled into each other, and with the train tracks buried under drifts, the once constant flow of supplies had ground to a halt. The townspeople were growing desperate. Clara knew that desperation well, but she refused to let it seep into her bones. She had too many mouths to feed, too many eyes watching her. And so every morning, as the snow continued to pile up outside, she sat at her sewing machine. The girls played at her feet, shuffling the last of their toys, but their faces were thinner than the last time she had seen them, their once cheerful eyes dimmed by hunger. The food stores were running low. The last of the flour had been stretched thin, and the tub of lard was almost gone. "Ma, when's the snow gonna stop?" Lily asked one morning, her voice thick with the strain of weeks without fresh food. Clara stopped stitching for a moment, her fingers still on the needle. She couldn't answer. Instead, she looked at the half-finished dress in her lap. It was for the youngest, Marcy, whose feet were cold even in layers of socks. "I don't know, darling," Clara said, forcing a smile as she glanced over her shoulder. "But we'll be fine. I'll make sure of it." She didn't know when or how, but she had promised herself that they would survive. The harsh whispers of others, those who had already left for the city or those who had abandoned their claims, felt distant now. In her quiet, humble home, she had her family, and she would fight to keep them. Her hands moved again, steadying her mind. The rhythm of the sewing machine, the sound of the needle pulling through the fabric, was her only constant now. It was a steady beat in the silence of the world that had crumbled. The community had once called her methods foolish, but Clara was no longer listening to their voices. By the time the sun set, casting a soft glow through the window on the thickening snow, the dress for Marcy was finished. It wasn't perfect. The seams were uneven, and the fabric felt stiff from the rough sack material, but it was warm, and it was hers. Clara could already see the joy in her daughter's eyes when she wore it. That night, after the fire had burned down to embers, Clara held her family close. The wind still whipped at the cabin, but in the quiet there was something more, something stronger than the cold outside. It was the strength of the choices she had made and the determination that filled every stitch. Weeks passed, and the weather grew colder still. The winds of the Great Plains howled, rattling the cabin's thin walls, while the snow continued to fall, never quite ceasing. Yet, inside, Clara's hands never stopped moving. She sewed when the sun came up, and she sewed when it dipped below the horizon, the sound of the needle scraping against fabric becoming the only steady heartbeat in a world turned chaotic. Lily's dress was finished next, its dull beige fabric coming to life beneath Clara's hands. It was a simple design, one she had hoped would lift Lily's spirits. Yet, every time she looked at her eldest daughter, she saw the strain in her eyes, the quiet acceptance of their hardship. Lily had always been the strongest of the three, the one who would go out into the fields to help her father, the one who would coax a smile from Marcy when she was near tears. But lately, even she had seemed subdued. The weight of their reality was becoming too much for anyone to bear. The situation in town was only getting worse. Every day, people would come by the cabin, offering little more than sad, hollow words. The store shelves were barren, the local market empty. Families who had once relied on the community for help were now hoarding what little they had, afraid that the next storm would bring the final blow. And yet, Clara never let the fear show. She couldn't afford to. There were days when she didn't know how they would survive, but every time she looked at her children, she found the strength to keep going. One evening, as Clara finished up a shirt for Thomas, she heard a knock at the door. She stood quickly, brushing the thread from her lap and moving to the window. Through the glass, she saw two familiar faces, neighbors, who had been silent for weeks now, the Martins. Thomas had taken the shotgun and headed out to check on the livestock. but Clara knew it wasn't livestock they needed help with. The look on their faces was desperate, their cheeks hollowed from hunger. They had come for something, just as they always did when the snow piled up too high to reach the town. Clara opened the door, and the cold air rushed in, stinging her skin. She greeted them with a forced smile. "We've run out of everything," Mrs. Martin said, her voice low, trembling. "Do you have any food you could spare? Just enough to get through the next storm?" Clara's heart clenched. The word spare stung. What was there to spare? They had nothing left but what she had made with her hands, and even that wouldn't last forever. She paused, looking over the Martins, then at her daughters huddled by the fire. The weight of the question hung in the air. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice calm and firm. "I can give you flour. It's not much, but it will get you through a few days." She turned to the cupboard, her fingers brushing the last of their supply. It wasn't enough for all of them, but it was all she had. As she handed it over, she caught Lily's eyes across the room, watching her every movement. "We'll make it," Clara whispered under her breath, more for herself than anyone else. And when Mrs. Martin left, clutching the small bag of flour, Clara's heart beat steady again. They would make it one stitch, one day at a time. The snow didn't stop. Days turned into weeks, and then into months, but the wind never ceased. Every night, Clara would lie awake listening to the groaning walls, the steady beat of the storm as it battered the cabin. The fire had become their only source of heat, the only shield against the cold. There were moments when the weight of the winter seemed too much to bear, when the thin walls felt like a prison and the cold pressed in from every side. But Clara didn't give in. She couldn't. Each morning, she woke up to the same silent prayer, "We will survive," and each night she fell asleep with the same promise, "Tomorrow will come." In the mornings, Clara and the girls would work together to clear the snow from around the cabin. It was a task that took most of the day, their faces flushed from the cold, their breath coming in visible puffs. They bundled themselves in layers of clothes, the same feed sack dresses now patched with whatever fabric they had left, but there was a lightness in their movements. Even in the biting cold, there was a shared purpose between them, something unspoken that held them together. Lily and Marcy had learned to fill their time with little games, building small houses out of snow or pretending to herd cattle in the empty yard. But as the days grew longer, Clara could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the weariness that came from surviving not just the winter, but the weight of everything else, the loss, the hunger, the feeling of being forgotten. Thomas had grown quieter too, spending more time outside in the bitter wind, his hands raw from working the land, doing what little he could to keep their farm from slipping further into ruin. He never complained, but Clara knew the toll it was taking on him. His shoulders had grown hunched from the weight of it all. The storms had taken more than just their crops, they had taken the will to dream. Still, there were moments of hope. Clara saw it in the way the girls smiled when the first buds of spring began to peek through the snow, and in the way Thomas would set down his shovel one evening, a quiet smile creeping over his face as he wiped the sweat from his brow. "The land'll come back," he would say, though Clara wasn't sure he believed it. But she believed it. She had to. And so, every day, she worked and she sewed, stitching together not just fabric, but the pieces of their lives. As the last of the dohent, snow began to melt, revealing the barren fields beneath. Clara stood by the window, watching the world shift. The land, once so full of life, now lay empty and worn, but there was something in the way the sunlight hit the cracked earth, something that whispered of renewal. Clara set down her sewing and walked outside, her footsteps crunching in the wet snow. She stood for a moment, looking at the barren fields that stretched before her. The storm had taken so much, but it had left something, too, something that could never be taken away, the strength to survive, to endure, to rebuild. And then, in the distance, Clara saw it. A small green shoot poking through the earth, the first sign of spring, a tiny spark of life, fragile but determined. Her heart lifted, and she smiled. She had made it through the winter. She had made it through the storm, and in that moment, she knew no matter what lay ahead, they would keep going, one stitch at a time.